huge financial debt for England.
Okay. Huge debt for England. Big, major consequence. Jeff?
Kind of unify America.
Did help to unify the colonies a bit. Still not, like America, but they're starting to come together a little bit. Jenny, anything else to add to that?
Wasn't the colonies ended up trading with the French and Indies? Would that be like a consequence or?
Well, they did do that. What did that lead to? The fact that they were trading with the French.
Did it make England mad?
Yeah. It actually hurt relationship with Britain because of some of the stuff that they did.
I think another thing that drove a wedge between them was the ideals. You've seen the ideals of Britain versus the ideals of the States, and they weren't really kosher to each other.
I agree with that. I'm going to just leave it alone, though. But, yeah, it definitely, this war brought out some real differences between the way the Americans and the way the British saw things. Even though the Americans are considered part of the British Empire, it really did bring out their differences more so than their similarities. Tyler?
Did it expand England's territory over America?
Don't say that like a question.
Well, I was just making sure. That's what I read.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's huge, the difference in terms of what Britain gains through the French and Indian War, right?
Everything east of the Mississippi.
Yeah, everything east of the Mississippi becomes part of their territory.
And then half of west of the islands, too.
I love this map. This is 1754. This is the way things looked before, or as the French and Indian War was getting started. So you basically have, you see Russia. Russia's got territory up around Alaska, but that's kind of important at this point. But you've got the French in purple, the English in green, and the Spanish in orange, or whatever that color is. So this is the way the empire, or the empires looked in 1754. So you see France, right? France? No France. France? No France. They're just not there. They're completely kicked out of the mainland except for
New Orleans.
if you look really close. You see it out here in the islands, a little bit of purple. So they're pretty much kicked out of everything except the islands. So they had to give up all of their mainland territory, not just to England, but to Spain. Spain has everything west of the Mississippi, and England has everything east. So England gains a lot more territory, and is happy about that to a point. But what's another consequence of the war? Wow, that's nice. Anybody have anything else?
Don't the Indians kind of get the shaft at the end of all of it, because even the ones that didn't really take part in the war still didn't take part in the war, so that kind of fits a lot.
Yeah. The Indians definitely get the shaft. They're really the losers, because whether it's the French or the English, they end up on bad terms with everybody. So, and they obviously lose more territory because the English are going to move into that territory, and the English were not as accommodating to the Indians as the French had been. The English are not. Remember, the French had kind of intermarried with the Indians. They traded with them. They had a better relationship with them. The English had always tried to kind of stay away from them. But staying away from them didn't mean you stay there and we stay here. What did it mean? We move into your territory and you get out. That's basically the way the English did things. So the Indians, right at the end of the war, the Indians try to strike back. And I don't know if your book went into this. Did it talk about Pontiac's uprising? some of the Indians in the Ohio River Valley over here decided to join together and to try to fight against the British before they had a chance to really get themselves established. And they attacked a lot of the forts in the Ohio River Valley. Forts that had been French forts, but now the British were moving into. So in this transition period, they tried to attack and to gain back some of that territory, to be able to get a hold of it. Well, the British were able to put down, Pontiac was the leader of this uprising, so it's called Pontiac's Uprising. The British were able to put that uprising down, but it made them more fearful of the Indians and more concerned about what it was going to take to keep the Indians under control. Because they're in debt majorly already, and now they're going to have to keep troops out there on the frontier to protect the colonists. And if they have these kinds of issues with the Indians, then it's going to obviously take more troops and more ammunition and guns and everything else. So Britain is attempting to control that, and what was their response? How were they going to control that?
Scalping.
What? The proclamation line. So that's what you see on that map there is the proclamation line. I'm moving into question number 2 while doing this, but we'll go back to 1 here in a second. So what's that line represent?
What is colonies and what is British territory?
Sort of.
The
But
colonists kind of crossed that line.
They didn't want trading and fighting. They didn't want the Americans to go over that line
Right.
to trade because it would make more fighting.
well, not just to trade, but they don't want them to settle over that line.
Yeah.
They're basically telling the American colonists, you can't cross this line. Now, was there a real line? They didn't draw the line across the top of the Appalachian Mountains. I know that sounds funny, but I actually had a student in Western Civ that thought that there was a real iron curtain that was placed across Europe after World War II. They wanted to go to Europe and see the Iron Curtain. There was never an Iron Curtain. Now, what were they confusing it with?
Berlin Wall.
The Berlin Wall, which there was a Berlin Wall, but there was never an Iron Curtain that was placed across the continent. Okay, it was a figure of speech. Anyway, so there's not obviously a line that's drawn, but they basically said, okay, we're going to say that there's this, imaginary line that you should not cross over, because if you do, it's probably going to lead to conflict with the Indians. And we can't afford that right now. We can't afford more wars with the Indians when we're trying to get ourselves out of debt. So the colonists said, sure, we understand, we'll do whatever you say, we want to be as helpful as possible.
Except that we're going to go over there.
But,
Except that we're going to go over there.
yeah. They said that, but they went over there anyway, right? No, they were like, screw you. We worked hard for this. We just won this war against the French. We should have every right to move into that territory. This is another thing that is kind of a result of the French and Indian War, because somebody said it unifies them, but it also creates kind of a spirit of nationalism, a sense of pride in what they've accomplished, that they've been able to drive the French out of their territory.
Well, they were fighting it by themselves in the beginning.
Well, they were in the beginning, you're right. But to be honest, after about 1756, most of the fighting was being done by the British regulars, and the Americans, somebody said the selling to the French, the Americans were often undermining the war effort because they were just trying to make a profit, and if the French were willing to pay them, they would sell to the French. So if you were a British soldier in America at this time, they didn't have a very high opinion of the Americans. Most of the American regiments or militia were pretty disorganized. They didn't really have any kind of, and from being in the military that there has to be a hierarchy and somebody's in charge.
They call themselves the People's Army.
Exactly. And to them, a people's army meant you get your militia together and the group of you decide who's going to be in charge today. I don't know what they call them, what the person's name or title would have been, captain or something like that. But they would choose that person. But then if they got ticked off with the person, they would say, okay, you're not captain anymore. A military doesn't work very well that way. And so the British could not understand the way the American military was operating, because they really didn't have an army, so to speak. They didn't respect them, definitely didn't think that the Americans did what they could have done to help the cause. The Americans definitely wouldn't pay for it if they weren't willing to contribute financially toward the war cause.
Didn't the British feel that they were fighting pretty much for them, and that's really why they were really angry at them for not
Now, you can see where Americans may disagree with that, but the British did feel like, we're coming over here and we're fighting to protect your land, and you're not even willing to, do your part.
We don't contribute.
What?
We don't contribute.
Yeah. Especially when you're selling to the enemy. I mean, that doesn't, it's not going to make the British soldiers feel very good that you're undermining what we're doing by giving them supplies and helping them out. I was going to make a point. What was my point? Oh, so you get to the end of the war, and Britain has won. So in a sense, the Americans have won. And this, I always think of my son when I think about this because, if you ever played sports, who's been on a sports team? Okay, when you play sports, you always have those kids that sit the bench all the time because they're just not good enough to play. But when the game's over with, a lot of times they're the biggest trash talkers. They're the ones walking around bragging about how great their team is and how they trashed this other team and stuff, and yet they wouldn't even get on the court or they didn't get out there on the field. Well, that's my son. He played most of the sports in high school, but he was horrible. And when he did play, he screwed up. But then he was the biggest trash talker when the game was over with. I mean, he was the biggest braggart in the world. Well, that's what the Americans remind me. The war's over with, they're all puffed up and proud about what they've accomplished, but really, most of what was done by the British. But yet it's the Americans that are the ones running around saying, look what we accomplished, and therefore we have the right, or we should have the right, to move into this new territory that we've just conquered. So they want to move into that land.
Wasn't another consequence the fact that the British got weaker because of the war? They got much weaker because they used so many...
Well, it depends on what you mean by weaker. I think financially, because they were struggling so much, there was a weakness there. Militarily and territorially, they grew and were seen by the rest of the world as being, because remember, mercantilism, the idea is the more that you have means the less that I have. So Britain comes out of this being perceived as the greatest world empire at the time. However, there's internal weaknesses that they have to address, and one of those things is their financial situation is so dire that they really feel like they need to get a handle on that. Now, keep in mind, though, in this day and age, is our country in debt?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
A little bit?
$27 trillion worth.
Quite a bit, right? I mean, do we, I mean, I know none of us are happy about that, but do we or anybody else in the world think that just because a country's in debt, it means that they're on the brink of collapse?
No.
We live with debt most of the time. We don't assume that that's always, I mean, obviously ours is so great that it's not a good thing, but we don't always assume that that's just a terrible, horrible thing. In this time period, they did. They really believed the country had to operate with a balanced budget. If they didn't, they felt that that country was on the brink of collapse. So part of what Great Britain is going through here is this idea that, oh, we're so much in debt, then that's going to mean that we're not going to be able to continue as a great world power. Now, we've changed our thinking on that, but that was the way people perceived things back in this time period. And we did really all the way up until, in this country anyway, Roosevelt. Because we believed that we had to have a balanced budget in this country. And every time we got a little bit in debt, everybody panicked. And then, when I say Roosevelt, I mean FDR, during the Depression and then World War II. And we went deeply in debt, at least deeply in debt for that time period during World War II. But we had basically come out of that and come back into a surplus by 1960. So within 15 years after World War II, we had paid off our debt and we're back into a surplus. But up until that point, one of the reasons why, who was president before FDR? Hoover. What did Hoover do to help people who became unemployed during the Depression? What? For the most part, nothing. He did a little bit. He actually did more than people give him credit for. But compared to FDR, he did very little. So he was just a horrible, terrible person, right? That's why everybody thinks of him. They just think he was the worst president in the world. But why did he not do anything?
He believed that the economy would fix itself on its own.
He definitely thought that the economy would take care of itself. That, you just give it some time and it'll bounce back on its own. What other reasons? What was I just saying?
Yeah.
whole nonsense.
What?
Were they in debt?
They would have been in debt.
No, they were.
See, they had a balanced budget. He was afraid that if he starts doing handouts or starts creating, government public works projects and stuff like that, the country will go into debt, and you can't do that. That would be the worst thing in the world. At least that was what he thought, and that's what most economists in that time period thought, that you can't go into debt. That would just add more problems to the problems the country already has.
Well, and it isn't good, but it's not.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Now, so if you aren't going to help these people that are literally starving to death on our streets, how are they supposed to get help? What would Hoover's response have been?
Tough luck.
No? He actually was not as cold-hearted as people made him out to be,
Look to your neighbor.
which would be back in that time period. Where would you find that help? What? The church. The church was supposed to be one of the key places that where you go to the church and the church tries to find ways to help you. The church, other community groups, and things like the Salvation Army. I mean, that type of organization existed back then, and that's where, the assistance for people needs to come from charity, not from the government. And so in a sense, it comes from us. We help each other. We don't look to the government to fix our problems for us. And it's really only been since FDR that we've done that. That when things aren't going well, we expect the government to fix it. We don't look to each other to try to find solutions.
That was FDR. And didn't even bring us out of the debt. The war brought us out of the debt.
Which, don't get me wrong, I actually think FDR was on the right track, but you're right that
Well, I mean, I'm not saying he was a bad president. I mean, he was a good president. Herb Hoover wasn't that bad of a president. It's just, to get out of the debt, we had to come together as a nation. And that's, FDR did all those government things, but it didn't do anything until we supported the war, Like, when we supported the war, we put all our efforts into it, and it helped out.
Hoover just had bad luck. He just happened to be president
At that time.
at the time of the stock market crash and
because if you look at Hoover's record before he became president, he actually was a great politician. I mean, he did some really cool stuff prior to the Depression. Then he becomes president, and boom. It's kind of like, I feel like George W. Bush, even though he's not my favorite president in the world.
9/11.
I feel like, he gets a bad rap because his whole presidency is defined by 9/11 and his response to it. He didn't really get a chance to just be president. He had to deal with 9/11, and everything's defined by that. Same thing with Hoover. Everything's defined by the Great Depression.
I don't think he really had a shot at it anyways. His daddy was on his days.
And I don't know. I just don't think we'll ever really know what he could have done as president if he had really had the chance to deal with it without dealing with that. Going back to question number 1, consequences of the French and Indian War. Why is this particular war so significant for American history? I mean, we've had other wars, that we fought and stuff, but why might this war be so significant?
it was the first step to the revolution. It was, we started to break away.
British felt we didn't support their war enough, and they felt that we needed to support more of Britain, and we didn't feel that way.
That's how the taxes started, because Britain had debt to be paid off.
Yeah, all of what you guys just said all kind of leads to the same thing, because this war brought out the differences. I think somebody said before, the differences between the two. It shows the fact that they're kind of moving in different directions, and then as Britain begins to try to tax to gain some of the money back, the Americans reacted strongly to that because they didn't feel that the tax was appropriate, going back to what we said before about virtual versus actual representation. So it brings out these differences in the way that these two countries or these two different areas view how government should be done, and also the role that the people have in that government. I find it interesting that the Americans don't want to be taxed without representation, but they also don't seem to really want to
Be represented.
do their part. What?
I said to be represented.
Well, it's funny because they say that the reason why they don't want to be taxed is because they don't have representation, but really what it comes down to is they just don't want to be taxed. Because if Britain had been smart and said, okay, go ahead, bring some representatives over here. We'll let you have some people sit in Parliament. But if you had sent people over there from America to be represented, and let's say this group over here are the American representatives, and you guys are all the rest of the representatives of Parliament, and I stand up and say, I think we should tax the American colonies, who's in favor? You guys are all going to say aye, they're going to say nay, but they get outvoted, so you get to tax them. And they can't say they don't have representation, right? You know, I don't know that it was really all about representation. I think a lot of it was just about, we've gone all these years and you haven't taxed us, you haven't really tried to control us very much. The rules that you do have in place, you haven't enforced. And boom, we get to 1763 and all of a sudden you want to slap all these rules on us. You want to start putting all these regulations on us.
I think that's the biggest thing is the states started to look at Britain as more of an ally than part of their actual government. Because they were already internally forming their own government to begin with. They had been running themselves for so long that...
Right. They weren't really seeing Britain as their boss. It was more like, we just happen to work together to win this war, but you know, we're not really seeing you anymore as being truly in charge of us. But keep in mind too, well, let's go to the last question. So, do you think they had the right to tax the American colonies?
In the beginning I do, but like I said, I think that after they let them run so long by themselves, that they had given up their rights.
I said that they did, but I have, you know, it's mixed. You can have arguments in both cases.
I think that they did have a right just because of what the colonists had done during the war, that they weren't funding their own war effort, and that they were making them do it. But then again, the question asked, do you think that they went about it the right way? And I don't think that they did, because they had taxes that were in place on them prior to that time, and they weren't enforced. And the only way that you're going to be able to pull something off like that is if you're consistent in everything that you do. And because they weren't, then you can't try to implement something on somebody if you haven't been implementing the same ideology prior to that. And they had every right to go about it, to try to recoup their losses from a large amount of debt. I mean, 7 years back then, it's a lot of money to be put out, and for the colonists. So they had every right to go about it. They just didn't have the right means to go about it because they hadn't been doing it right to begin with.
And I think that he makes a good point, because if you, I've used this example in here before, but you know, as a parent, if you got kids and you lay down the rules, but then you don't enforce the rules, then kids start to get the idea that the rules really don't exist. And then if all of a sudden you try to, you know, resurrect them, yeah, they rebel. It doesn't go over very well, because it's like, wait a minute, you can't, you know, we've been doing it this way for a long time. You can't just all of a sudden change the rules in midstream here.
I went to a substitute teaching class, and they said that if you go into a classroom, they'd like challenge us to experiment. Go into a classroom and be nice, and then try to come back and set a rule. You're not going to get any control over the classroom. But if you go in the rules and you set the rules, and then you kind of ease off of it, then you're going to be easy. It's going to be easier to control your class. That's pretty much the same thing that's going on there.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think that's generally the way human nature works. Now, on the other hand, I think that the American colonists were basically a bunch of spoiled brats. They had all the benefits of being English citizens. They had, you know, the protection of the English military. They pretty much were not being taxed. Did I already say this? The other class in this class get mixed up, because there were no direct taxes on the American colonists that went back. So you didn't get taxed with, on goods or property or anything where that money went back to England. The only taxes that they had imposed on them were on their trade. So those people involved in trade, there were taxes and regulations imposed on that would bring income to Great Britain. But as far as taxing an individual family, like sales tax or property tax, they didn't have any of that. Not that went to Britain. Now, Americans pay taxes, but they pay taxes to their own communities. Their legislatures, their assemblies passed taxes to raise money for the church and other things that they needed in their community. In England, as I said before, they were paying 25 times the amount of tax that American was paying. So when this happens and they need to try to pay off their debt, they can't really look to the English people and say, we're going to tax you more, because they feel like they're already completely overburdened with tax. So they turned to the Americans, and first of all, I don't think your book says this, but first of all, they actually said to them, look, we really need your guys' help. You need to start contributing, especially to pay for these troops that we're going to have to keep on the frontier to protect you. So how much are you willing to contribute, and how do you want to go about it? Any Americans huddled up?
And this morning,
Came back? That's okay. We'd rather not be taxed. They said, no, you misunderstood. That wasn't an option. We were just saying, you have to be taxed, but how do you want to do it? We're going to give you the opportunity to come up with your own plan. Huddle up again. Nah, it's okay. We don't want to be taxed. So Britain finally was like, well, sorry, if you're not willing to come up with a plan, we're going to have to find our own plan.
Yeah, but that was entirely Britain's fault because they never enforced anything.
I agree with that. But the Americans still have to take the step. If they really want independence, they have to take the step and say, no, we don't want to be part of your country anymore. And that's what this is coming to. Because if you're going to, even if Britain did it inappropriately, they still have the right to expect the Americans to contribute.
Yeah, but most people like a free ride. I mean, if you're getting a handout, you're going to take advantage for as long as possible.
Right. And once it came to this point, when things came to a head, and Britain said, okay, we're tired of you just, freeloading off of us, the Americans had to make a decision. Are they willing to buckle under and begin to contribute, or do they want to split and go the other way? And obviously that's what it eventually came down to.
Didn't the book also say that Britain didn't want America to become competition for them, and so that was part of their motives for doing that too, and that's not right either.
Well, I'm not really trying to say that what Britain did was totally right. I mean, their whole approach to it was not. I mean, they could have probably done this and continued to keep the American colonies if they had just approached it very differently. Because I think that what they did is they hit them. See, it's one thing, what are some of the things that they did that they hit them with right after the war was over?
Proclamation of 1763.
Okay, that's one of the very first things, right? What else?
Stamp Act.
What?
Stamp Act.
Okay, that's a little later, but
Tax exemption.
Sugar Act, Currency Act, Stamp Act, and even before these things, they began to say, okay, all of those navigation laws that have been on the books for 100 years that we've never enforced, we're going to start enforcing those. Okay, so when you get here, these two are 1764. This one's 1765. And there's other things too. There's one of the more important ones. I think your book calls it the Mutiny Act, but I usually refer to it as the Quartering Act. And there's other more minor things, but you've got all of these kind of major things that they begin to pass on them. So if you look at all of these different things in terms of the amount of money it was going to cost the American colonists, the way that I like to, example that I like to give, and maybe I've already done this in this class, but the whole idea of if you go to the convenience store to buy a Coke, have I done that with you? No? So if you go buy a Coke, let's say it's $1, right? How much is it going to cost you? $1 what? Depends on where you live, right? In my county, it's $1.07. Up here, it's $1.06, I think, right? 6% tax. Okay, so if you go in there and every morning you go in and buy your Coke and it's always $1.06, and you've got the exact change every morning. You know, here's $1, here's a nickel, grab a little penny out of the thing, here's $1.06, right? Okay, so there's your $1.06, and you go in one morning, you know, say hi to the clerk that knows you and everything, and then, you know, they bring up your Coke and they say, oh, it's $1.07. I mean, are you just going to take the Coke and throw it in her face? You can't do that to me. You can't charge me another penny. I've been paying $1.06 for years. I'm not going to pay that. Is that what you're going to do?
You're gonna pay. If you really want it.
Even if you have to grab the penny out of the other little thing there, right? Are you really, I mean, who is going to throw a fit over paying one more penny for a Coke?
I'll tell you what, people get upset about paying 40
I know,
cents
some
for a
people
pack of
do, but
cigarettes.
the average person is not going to do that, right? My point being, all of these things are pretty much like that. These are very minor taxes. It's not, you know, the book makes it sound like they hit them with this and hit them with that and all these huge taxes and the Americans are just being overwhelmed with it. They're minor taxes. They were not going to raise that much revenue. It's not about the amount of the tax. It's about the principle of you don't have the right to tax us without our consent. And the fact that they want to pay taxes anyway. Now, if of all of these things, the one that I would have the most trouble with is this one. What did that do?
They get rid of all the paper.
Got rid of all the paper money in the colonies. The paper money that they used as a way to do business with each other. Why is that a problem?
It ain't very gold.
But
Now they can't do business as well.
because what do they have to be able to do business?
Gold and silver.
Gold and silver, which is not plentiful in America. It basically shrinks the money supply. And that causes issues when you do that in the economy. That's why we have a Federal Reserve that keeps raising it and, you know, lowering it and changing it to try to keep the money supply where it should be to keep either inflation or deflation from occurring. Not that it, you know, you do it perfectly, but you try to do it as best as you can. This was really very much an issue for the American colonists because they were already starting to go into a depression. Why? Why would they begin to have a possible depression after the war was over with?
The French were grounds, they couldn't sell them to them anymore.
Okay, so they don't have the French to sell to.
And weren't they expanding, so what did that cost?
That could have issues, but anytime you're in the middle of a war, you have to produce all these supplies and you have to be able to purchase all these supplies and stuff because you've got the war going on. So the war actually caused kind of a boom in the economy, and the merchants in America had all of these different, whether it was the British or the French, all these different people to sell stuff to. War's over with, all of that leaves, and the economy began to go into a downturn. So the Americans were already experiencing a downturn in their economy, and then you shut off all of their currency and make money even more difficult to come by, and it created a pretty serious economic depression in this country. So that was probably, even though it was completely unintentional on the part of Great Britain, that was probably the worst of all of the things that they did in terms of the impact it had on their economy. Now, the other thing that they found very galling was the Quartering Act. What did that say you had to do?
You had to take in the troops if they were there. They had every right to come in and stay.
That you had to quarter the troops. Now, that didn't mean you had to give them your master bedroom. Not that they really had that for the most part. But you could put them in the barn. But you had to give them shelter and you had to feed them. Now, I don't know how many of you would, you know, if all of a sudden wherever you live, if they said, oh, we can't afford to pay our policemen enough for them to have their own house. So, you know, you as citizens have to take them into your home, give them a place to live and feed them every day. How many of us would want to do that? I mean, even if you're not doing anything wrong, don't necessarily want a cop living in your house, right? So that is not going to go over well. Even though the Americans were doing it and had been doing it, most of the time willingly.
They were
Now to say you have to do this, nobody likes to be told that they have to do something. You know, if I choose to do it out of the goodness of my heart, that's one thing. But to tell me I have to do it, you know, that doesn't go over well. So, again, don't get me wrong, you don't have to agree with me. I think Great Britain did have every right to tax the American colonies. I do also think that they probably could have handled it very differently. But you have every right to say, no, I don't think they had a right to tax them, and the Americans should have been allowed to just do their own thing. I mean, again, it's all about your opinion, but your opinion backed up with evidence in terms of why you believe the way that you do, your interpretation of the information.